Hi, everyone. I hope you have a wonderful day. Thank you for joining me today. My name is Jakub, and I'm JavaScript engineer at Help Scout. And I want to welcome you to my talk about accessibility. Short story of the origin of this talk. So when I joined my current company, Help Scout, it was going through the stage of improving the accessibility for our products. And truth be told, I did not have a lot to do with accessibility before. I mean, I knew some basic things, but I wasn't really in a project or company that put accessibility in the important spot. So I had some learning to do. I did training, I did some reading, and I started to implement accessibility during my regular work. Now, this was and still is a really interesting experience that taught me a lot about why accessibility is important in the first place, why we should think about accessibility up front and make it like integral part of our project. And why we should even care about accessibility. And today I'd like to share my experiences with you and hopefully get you interested in the topic and encouraged to do accessibility in your own projects or maybe just improve on what you have already. So this talk is, of course, about accessibility. And I'll start with talking about the first approach, what it is, why it's important, and how it relates to accessibility. Then I move to the support that we get for accessibility on the web, some guidelines, some rules. Then a few words about actual reasons why you want to be accessible. And I'll finish with mentioning accessibility testing and the tools that we can use for that. Okay, so by saying first, I mean to make something really important, to put it on the top spot, to think about it up front, to make it integral part of design development process from the very beginning to the very end of the project, maybe even beyond that. In software development, we don't have just one first. There are different areas and each might have its own, or even one area might have multiple. The important thing is that none of them is less or more important than the other. And we should find good spot for all of them and treat them on equal terms. And going back a bit to the title, so accessibility first is the new mobile first. By saying that, I don't mean that accessibility should replace mobile or that one is more important than the other. What I rather mean is that mobile first, being mobile friendly is something that we know, most of us do. We acknowledge why it's important and how much value it gives us. With accessibility, while we probably heard about this, all of us heard about this, we're not always doing this and we don't treat it with the respect and importance that it deserves. So my intention here is to show you that we should make it something really important because it gives a lot of value. On the exact reasons why we need to be accessible, I'll mention a bit later. But now let me first show you the first approaches that we have in software development. So of course we have mobile first. We have test-driven development. There is no first in the name, but still it's about putting tests, like writing tests before the implementation and putting tests on important spot. And we have domain-driven design. So we first create the core domain of our application, then build around that. And we have accessibility first. Like each of them is different in a way that how we implement them, when we implement them, and general approach to them. But they all share a few things, like the reasons why we actually want to do this upfront, like have this first approach, not just do it at any point of our project. The first is cost, because it's much cheaper to start with those things and make them integral part of your project than to try to add them later on in some later stage. And let's take as an example mobile first or accessibility first. They are kind of similar in this area in a way that they both involve some code, some design, some UX, and it wouldn't work that you are working on some project for a year and one day you say, okay, let's make it mobile friendly, or let's make it accessible, and then be done in a week or two. It just wouldn't work like this, because to be mobile friendly, to be accessible, you might need to adjust the design. So you might redesign significant portion of your application, or you might just need to rewrite also significant portion of the code, which also takes time, takes a lot of resources, and is again much more costly than having it integrated from the start. The other is that it improves quality. Like all those things that I mentioned, they improve the quality themselves, like mobile friendly, like test, etc. But if you add them later on the project, you might need to do some hacking, you might need to do some workaround to feed them into your project. And while you might improve the quality for a short term, it would be hard to maintain it for a longer term, because it wouldn't fit to the philosophy that you have from the start. But if you keep doing it from the start, like start doing with those things, then it's much easier to maintain this quality overall. Okay, so what actually is accessibility? Taking this short definition, but this just one sentence that actually says everything about accessibility. It's a practice of making your website usable by as many people as possible. And as many people as possible is the important part here, because when we think about accessibility, we usually think about making our pages, our apps, so that they can be used by users with some sort of disabilities, whatever this disability might be. And while this is very important group that we should aim to support, it's not only just about them. It's also to be accessible for aging population, for users on mobile devices. So this like kind of interacts with the mobile first. And also like users on all alternative devices, and many more. Like in other words, like again, as many people as possible. So whoever they are, whatever they use, they should be able to use web, and they should be able to use your web page or web app. So in the web development, we luckily don't need to reinvent the wheel, and because we have great support on being accessible. Let me actually start from the end, so from the users of your application. They would most likely, in terms of accessibility, would need to use some sort of assistive technology to interact with your page, to read your page. And the problem is that those technologies, while they are great, they don't just automatically detect whatever is on your page. There's not like robot sitting in front of them and just reading with the page with vuejs. They need some assistance themselves. And of course, we have to provide that assistance by creating HTML, because in the end, it's just the HTML that they understand. And for that, we have example of such a assistive technology, for example, screen reader that just reads out the content of your page and let it interact with using, for example, keyboard or some other input. And we have great tools to be accessible in the first place. One, and the most important one, something to start with, is just using native HTML tags, like using tags that actually mean something. Because if you create like page full of divs, the assistive technology wouldn't be able to distinguish between one or the other. Because it doesn't know if one div, what this div is actually meaning. So even if you create like a div that looks like a button, works like a button, for assistive technology, it's not a button, it's just a div. So instead of doing this like workarounds, it's the best to start using native HTML tags like buttons, like headers, like mains, like all sorts of things that we have available in HTML nowadays. However, it's sometimes not always possible. Sometimes you need to customize your app. You need to use those divs of some other elements and make it look and work like something else. And for that, we have accessible rich internal application, which ARIA for short, which is just really a specification that extends HTML for us, extends the semantics. Basically, it just adds a bunch of different attributes to HTML, so that those assistive technologies can know about the what these elements would actually mean. And we have, for example, roles like list item. You should still use li element, native li element for list item. But if you cannot do this, then just assign it the role so that the technology knows what it is. Or states like aria checked, which means that, just putting it on a checkbox so that, again, this technology know that the checkbox is checked or not. The thing is that having just those semantics, just those attributes, it's not always enough to make our page truly accessible. And taking an example from the outside non-web world, we can say that ramps for wheelchair users are kind of a semantic extension to a sidewalk that you apply when there are stairs so that people can easily use the sidewalk if they cannot use the stairs. And so someone in the example that I have, the image that I have right here, so someone has applied this semantic, this ramp, but that's all they did. They didn't really, I think, thought it through, and this ramp is really not really accessible. Or this one, the ramp is much better. It could have been even better, but let's assume it's okay. We can even assume that it's the best ramp in the world. It's winning multiple awards every year in some ramp competitions. But what about that if you cannot really use it because you cannot go up to this ramp and then open the door and get inside because the door would collide with the ramp. This is not accessible as a whole thing, even though the ramp might be. So those examples might have been created because someone was strictly following the letter of the law, meaning that they had a specification that say build a ramp, so they did. However, as with everything, there is a bigger context. There needs to be some guidelines that help us understand how we connect different elements together so that they work as they should be. In this case, there should be something saying that the ramp should actually be maybe in front of the door, or the door should open to the other side. And we have something similar on the web. So even if you create the most accessible button, either using button element or some div and styling it, assigning proper roles, making it focusable and having the perfect colors, it's useless to keyboard-only users if they cannot actually tap to this button and click it using keyboard or some other input device. That's why, in addition to ARIA, we also have some guidelines that let us look at the bigger context. And they are defined mostly in those 3 documents that I have listed. The first one, which is something that we as the regular developers should be using the most. So Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. Web content is basically everything, almost everything that you see when you open the web page or some web app, all the text, all the buttons, almost all the inputs. Again, 95% of the web. And so again, this is something that should be addressed the most when you work with accessibility. Then we have authoring tools, accessibility guidelines. Authoring tool is a tool that lets you create some content on the web, like any kind of editor. For example, Google Docs might be a good example of authoring tool. And then we have user agent accessibility guidelines. So guidelines for creating a browser or some other user agent, as it says in the name. So I have example of this web content accessibility guideline, of the structure of it, what it contains in terms of, again, structure. And the same applies to all the other documents. The content is different, but structure is the same. So this is just a set of success criteria, or I just call them rules for short, which are divided into categories and levels. Categories are more like a semantic thing so that you know to which area this rule belongs to. But levels are, for me at least, they are more important and provide more information. So we have 3 levels, A, AA, AAA, and more A means the rule is more restrictive. Or looking at it from different side, A rule level marked as level A means that this rule must be followed so that the page is accessible. AA means should have, and AAA means nice to have. And while it's not necessary to aim always at the highest level, we should try to do this. In some cases, it might not be even possible to have this highest level, but we should do as much as we can to try to do this. Sometimes aiming the highest level might mean that you need to redesign your application to follow the description that is the rule that are for this AAA level. And the great starting point with Web Content Accessibility Guidelines is this quick reference that I have linked here, which is just list all the rules and have some examples of how to succeed with them, what not to do, different sorts of useful things. And I just want to show you how this, one of these rules looks like. The content is not really important at the moment. I don't want to dive too deep into this, but I just want to see you what the parts of the rule of each rule. So each rule has a number, and it has a name, it has level, and it has some description. Pretty simple thing. The descriptions are sometimes might be confusing, but we have a lot of resources to explain them to us. Okay, so why would you even want your page to be accessible? One of them, I think the most important thing is because it's the right thing to do. We never cannot assume that our users wouldn't need or we wouldn't need our page to be accessible, because you never know who would be using your app, who would be your users, especially if you want to sell your app. And even if you do now, what about in a month? There are around 1 billion people in the world, 50% of the population with some sort of disability, and it's their right to use the web, to use our page, the same way as everyone else does. It's our responsibility to make our page, not only our page, but the whole web, the whole internet, the whole world, hopefully, inclusive and not exclusive place. You can also think about being accessible is by creating the better world for the future version of yourself. Sadly, we all get old. And with age, we might get some sort of disability. I think the simplest example would be that our vision would be worse. And so you should create your page now, today, in a way that you would be using, you would want, in a way that it would help you to use them in multiple years. And even if you don't anticipate your page or your app to live as long as you do, then setting an example now that we should be and we have to be accessible, set the stage for the future generations so that they do this as well, and they create a web that you would be able to use in few years, in many years. And it's also about being friendly. If I have the same product, not the same product, two different products, one and having similar functionalities, one being fully accessible, the other not, I would probably choose the accessible one because it means that they care about the users, and there is higher chance that they would care about me as well. Other reason might be legal. In some industries, it's legally required for web apps, web pages to be accessible. And while it shouldn't be the main motivation, it's something that it's worth being aware of. And last reason that I have, but it's also really important, is that being accessible actually benefits everyone. And I really mean everyone, every single person can have their experience improved if our page is accessible. And there's something called curb cut effect, which going back a bit into history, back in the early 1900s, there was no such thing as these curb cuts. In the United States, it was introduced around 1940s, 1950s. I don't have the specific date, but somewhere around this time, as a facilitation for war veterans that came back from war with some kind of wounds. And they just needed those cuts so they can just simply use crosswalks. And even though it was intended for this group of people, it turned out to be really useful for everyone else. Nowadays, we don't we might not think about this, but we expect those cards to be on every crosswalk. They help us in a lot of situations. If you are riding a bike, if we are, skateboarding, if we are having these bags on the wheels, if we are, walking with baby stroller, in many, many different situations. So this means that when we design for disabilities, we make things better for everyone. And there's a lot of examples of that in the real world, but also on the web. Like some that I can relate to. For example, having proper tab navigation focus management for online forms. Like I can perfectly well use just my mouse to navigate through the form, but doing it with keyboard, with tabbing through elements, is just much faster, so it's more convenient to me. Having proper color contrast. It's when I have like light text on light background, my eyes would get tired very quickly to having to read a lot of text like this. If I have a good color contrast, then like it's just it's just much easier for me to read the content on the page. Video captions. If I cannot enable sound on the video for some reason, I can just turn on captions and I can perfectly well know what they are talking about in the video. Voice recognition. If I have my hands busy, I'll just try to dictate some message to my phone and it would send this message to someone that I want to. Like, all those things are essential for some people so they can use web, so they can use technology. For others, it's just a convenience. They might not even notice that something like this should exist if it would ever exist, but it really helps. It really just simplifies our lives. So please help others, because by that you would be helping yourself. At some point, you need to verify that your page is really accessible. And we do this by performing accessibility testing. And there is no magic here. It means just verifying all the guidelines or the rules, checking the attributes on HTML elements. And we have two kinds of tests. First tests are automated tests. And there's a bunch of tools that you can use to help us with this. So first tool, maybe not the most obvious, but should be the most common, is just having proper unit integration testing. And in the frontend world, I use this testing library family. So I write in React nowadays, so I just use a React testing library, but there's a version for each major framework. And while it's not just about using this specific library, you might use others. It's about what this library enforces you to do. It forces you to test as if, write tests as if the tests are real users of your application, which also includes accessibility. Because, for example, if you want to find a button on a page, so if you want to confirm an order on your page, and so you'll be looking for a button, something that looks like a button has confirm on it. Like, of course, in tests, we cannot just find something that looks like a button. We have to find something that is actually a button. So we find something by a role. And we find something by then a label. So we find some button, but then we need to find a button that says confirm. And we can just click it in tests. And by doing that, using those accessible selectors in tests, using the accessible ways to find an element, you have two in the price of one. One, you have tests that confirm your functionality, of course, and the other is that you check that your elements are actually accessible, at least to some extent. We also have eslint plugins to highlight some errors and missing attributes for us, like in HTML or in JSX. I'm writing in React, as I said in the previous slide, so I'm using this plugin, but I know there are plugins for each major framework. I think probably even vanilla.js, there is something. Then we have a set of tools called Axe from this DQ company. So they really they just do a lot of things around accessibility, like they do training, audits, run conferences, and they've created this set of really nice tools. For example, they have linter that you can attach to your GitHub, and it would recommend you ways to improve the accessibility if it's easy to do, if it's possible to do like in an automatic way. There is in-app testing tool that you can run alongside your app, and it would just highlight you the violations that you might have while you are using your app. Cypress extension, similar thing. So when you write Cypress tests, they would fail if there is some accessibility violation. It would tell you what it is about, why it's failing. And something that I use a lot, browser extension called AxDevTools, which lets you inspect your page or part of the page, some element, and it would list all the violations that are in this part of the page with some guidelines of how to which element it relates to, how to fix this, or some suggestions of what you should do. So I can really recommend this. And there is much more that they have, so you can go check on the page. And in general, there is a lot of more tools that I don't have time to list all of them. But for example, Lighthouse have also this inspection mode for accessibility violations. And if you want to check more, there is this nice list, huge list of the best tools that we have available, which is a good place to start if you are looking for something specific. Okay, but even though we have so many great tools, they wouldn't find every issue for us, because it's not possible to automate everything. They say that the best tools or combination of the best tools can find up to maybe 50% of accessibility violations. Example being we can automate to check if a label is missing. This is quite easy, but it's not easy to actually check if the label, to automatically check the label actually has the level of information that it needs to be. Does it say just a label or input, or does it actually provide information that what this input is about? So unfortunately, accessibility is more than just semantic static values, and it requires manual testing. And by manual testing, I mean, for example, using screen reader. So just run screen reader on your page and try to do the actions that you would do with mouse, or just using keyboard only. If you cannot do something that you would want to, then it means you are missing something and you should fix it in terms of accessibility. Even for screen reader, you can just turn off the display and only based on what you hear, and see how easy or complicated it is to use your page. Okay, I'm coming to an end of my talk. I just want to summarize and give you some guidelines, the things that I think are the most important that I would like you to take you from this talk. So please consider accessibility from the start and follow the guidelines. Achieving 100% accessibility might not be feasible. It's not always easy, but we should still do as much as we can. And that's also because we are obliged to make our page available to everyone and not exclude anyone from using it. It's important to know that everyone would actually benefit from accessibility. And we should use as many of the tools that we have available to help us with this. There's a bunch of great ones. And we should make accessibility testing part of our process. I don't know, for example, task list or PR list cannot be merged or closed until there are some accessibility violations. So I have this list of resources that I find useful. I know it's hard to get them from the slide that is on the screen for a few seconds. So if you want, I can send it to you. Just reach out to me on the next slide. I will have my contact information. But these are the great places to start with accessibility, or just expand on the knowledge that you might have already. So thank you very much for your attention. Again, I have my contact details here if you want to reach out for resources or for any other question. And yeah, thank you again. Please enjoy the rest of the conference and take care.